When you stop contacting a woman, something shifts, but not always in the dramatic way men expect. There is no single emotional script she follows. What happens depends on her level of interest, emotional investment, and how the dynamic was built before the silence. Still, one thing is consistent. Your absence changes the structure of attention. Most men misunderstand silence. They think it automatically creates panic, chasing, or regret. In reality, silence creates space, and space forces evaluation. She starts to interpret your absence based on what you represented in her life. That interpretation can lead to curiosity, indifference, relief, or even emotional discomfort. The key point is this: she is no longer reacting to your presence, she is reacting to your absence. And that absence becomes information. It tells her something changed, something ended, or something is no longer being maintained the way it used to be. Stoic behavior in this situation is not about trying to trigger a reaction. It is about removing emotional dependence from the outcome entirely. When you stop contacting her, you are no longer shaping the interaction in real time, so her internal processing becomes more visible over time. In this breakdown, you will see what actually tends to happen internally and behaviorally when contact stops, and how perception, emotion, and interest shift when your presence is no longer actively maintained. 1. Initial confusion and mental recalibration. When you stop contacting a woman, the first stage is often confusion, because the previous pattern of communication created a sense of continuity, and once that continuity breaks, her mind tries to quickly understand what changed. So she starts mentally reviewing recent interactions, your tone, your last messages, and your overall behavior before the silence, not because she is immediately emotional, but because the mind naturally seeks explanation when a predictable pattern stops, and this is where recalibration begins. She is no longer simply responding to you. She is trying to interpret your absence, and that interpretation depends heavily on the emotional weight you had in her life before you stopped contacting her. If your presence was consistent and emotionally significant, the silence feels more noticeable and requires more processing. But if the connection was already weak or low investment, the silence may register as something neutral at first. Another important detail is that during this stage, she may check for indirect signs of you, such as whether you are active, whether you are online, or whether anything about your behavior has changed, not necessarily out of emotional urgency, but out of curiosity and mental tracking, because the brain does not immediately let go of patterns it was used to, and it tries to confirm whether the change is temporary or intentional. Another key aspect is that confusion does not automatically equal emotional attachment. It simply means disruption of expectation, and how that develops depends on what the underlying emotional foundation was. If there was genuine interest, confusion can slowly turn into curiosity or even emotional reflection. But if interest was already low, confusion quickly fades into acceptance, and she adjusts to the new normal without much resistance. Another important point is that this stage is quiet internally, but significant structurally, because it marks the first moment where she is forced to engage with your absence instead of your presence, and that shift alone changes the dynamic from interaction-based to perception-based, meaning she is no longer reacting to what you say or do, but to the fact that you are no longer actively participating in her emotional environment, and that creates space for reevaluation, not action yet, but internal processing that will determine what follows next. 2. Curiosity and attention shift. After the initial confusion settles, a common response when you stop contacting a woman is curiosity, where her attention begins to shift from emotional interaction to behavioral observation. Because your absence creates a gap in the pattern she was used to, and the mind naturally tries to fill that gap with meaning. So she starts paying attention to whether you reappear, how long the silence continues, and whether anything about your behavior suggests a deliberate shift, and this is not always an emotional reaction at first. It is often observational, like checking for signals, noticing changes in your online presence, or thinking back on past conversations to reassess their meaning in light of your silence. Another important detail is that curiosity is often triggered more strongly when there was some level of emotional engagement before the silence, because the stronger the previous connection, the more noticeable the absence becomes, and the more the mind attempts to reconcile. That change, but curiosity does not guarantee action. It simply means your absence has created enough contrast to disrupt the normal flow of expectation, and this contrast is what begins to shift perception. Another key aspect is that she may start to reinterpret past interactions differently, assigning new meaning to things you said or did, not because those things changed, but because your absence changes the emotional context in which she remembers them. And this is where perception begins. To evolve independently of current interaction, another detail is that curiosity can also lead to indirect checking behavior, where she may look at your activity without engaging you directly, or ask subtle questions through mutual connections, or create situations where she might observe your response without fully initiating contact, and this reflects a state of evaluation rather than commitment, because she is still processing whether your silence is meaningful or temporary. Another important point is that curiosity is fragile. It can grow into deeper reflection if your absence remains consistent and emotionally neutral, or it can fade quickly if she concludes that nothing significant has changed. So the outcome of this stage is not determined by her initial curiosity, but by the consistency and stability of your continued absence, because inconsistency, such as reappearing emotionally or breaking silence impulsively, resets the entire process and brings the dynamic back to its original state, while steady absence allows perception to stabilize and either deepen or fade naturally over time. 3. Emotional deactivation or emotional reflection. After curiosity, a woman's response to your silence typically moves into one of two directions, either emotional deactivation or emotional reflection. And which one happens depends entirely on how strong the emotional foundation was before you stopped contacting her, because silence does not create emotion. It only reveals what was already there. So if her investment was low, she begins to emotionally detach from the idea of you without much internal conflict. She adjusts quickly, reduces mental focus on the connection, and returns attention to her own life. And this is what emotional deactivation looks like, a quiet reduction in emotional relevance, where you no longer occupy meaningful space in her thoughts, not out of anger or reaction, but out of absence of emotional reinforcement. And this is a natural protective mechanism where the mind stops investing energy in something that is no longer actively present. But if there was genuine emotional attachment, the silence can trigger reflection instead, where she begins to think more deeply about the connection, your behavior, what changed, and what your absence means in the context of her emotional experience. And this reflection is not always immediate or obvious. It often happens gradually as your absence continues without disruption. Another important detail is that emotional reflection does not automatically lead to action. It is an internal process where she reassesses your role in her emotional landscape. And during this phase, she may feel a mix of curiosity, uncertainty, and reevaluation of past interactions, but still not take any direct steps, because reflection is internal processing, not behavioral response. Another key aspect is that silence amplifies whatever emotional weight already existed, meaning if she had strong positive association with you, reflection becomes more likely, but if the connection was inconsistent or weak, deactivation becomes more dominant, and she simply moves on. Mentally without resistance, another important point is that many men misinterpret this stage by assuming reflection guarantees reconnection, but in reality, reflection only creates awareness. It does not create action. And whether anything follows depends on whether she still feels emotional value or simply recognizes absence without attachment. And this is why consistency in your silence is critical, because any interruption in that silence collapses both processes, resets perception, and brings the interaction back into active engagement instead of internal evaluation. So the key difference between deactivation and reflection is emotional depth before silence, not the silence itself, and your role is not to force either outcome, but to remain stable enough for one of them to unfold naturally without interference. 4. Testing through indirect signals. When you stop contacting a woman, another common response is indirect testing, where she does not fully re-engage, but she begins to send subtle signals to check whether you are still emotionally present, still available, or still responsive. And these signals are often low effort on purpose, because she is not yet committed to reopening direct communication. She is simply trying to measure your reaction without exposing her own intent, and this can show up in different ways depending on the context of the relationship, such as casual messages that don't fully lead anywhere, social media activity meant to gauge your attention, or timing-based engagement that appears designed to see if you will respond quickly or at all. And the key detail here is that testing behavior is not always about manipulation. It is often about uncertainty resolution, because when your presence disappears, she loses the reference point she was used to. So she tries to rebuild that reference point in a controlled way. Another important aspect is that these tests are not consistent. They come and go because they are driven by internal evaluation rather than stable intention, meaning she is not fully deciding to reconnect. She is checking whether reconnection would even be possible or welcomed, and your response during this stage becomes the deciding factor in how the situation develops, because if you respond with emotional urgency over excitement or immediate availability, you collapse the distance and return the dynamic to its previous imbalance. But if you respond calmly, neutrally, or not at all depending on context, you maintain the shift and force clearer internal evaluation. Another key point is that indirect testing often increases when your silence is consistent and emotionally stable, because the longer the absence continues without reaction, the more uncertainty builds. And uncertainty naturally increases attempts to gather information without direct confrontation, and this is where many men misread the situation as renewed interest, when in reality it is still evaluation behavior, not commitment. Another important detail is that testing loses strength if it does not produce emotional feedback, because its purpose is to measure influence, and without influence, the behavior either fades or escalates into direct communication, depending on emotional investment. So your consistency determines whether testing becomes a bridge back into communication or simply fades into silence. And the most important principle in this stage is not to overreact to small signals, because overreaction creates false momentum that does not reflect real emotional change, and instead you maintain a steady, controlled presence that does not reward uncertainty with emotional instability, allowing the dynamic to reveal its true direction naturally over time. 5. Reassessment of your value. After indirect testing begins or fades, the next stage in what a woman feels when you stop contacting her is reassessment, where she starts to reevaluate your overall value in her life based on your absence rather than your presence. And this shift is important because value is often only fully processed when something is no longer actively accessible, meaning your silence forces her to compare the version of you she remembers with the reality of your current absence. And this comparison can change perception over time depending on emotional depth, consistency, and past experiences. Another key detail is that reassessment is not purely emotional, it is also logical, where she considers what role you played in her life, what emotional impact you had, and whether your absence creates any meaningful gap or not. And this is where memory and emotion begin to mix, because past interactions are now being viewed through the lens of distance rather than active engagement. Another important aspect is that during reassessment, small details often become more significant in hindsight. Things she may have overlooked before can gain new meaning simply because there is now space to think about them without immediate interaction. And this is a natural psychological process where absence increases cognitive weighting of past experiences. Another key point is that reassessment can lead to two different directions. Either your value becomes more noticeable because of contrast created by absence, or it becomes less relevant as emotional attachment fades and other priorities take over, and which direction it goes depends on how strong the emotional connection was and how consistent your presence had been before you stopped contacting her. Another important detail is that reassessment is not immediate action. It is internal recalculation, meaning she is not necessarily doing anything externally yet. She is simply forming a new internal understanding of where you stand in her Emotional structure, and this is why silence is powerful but not automatic. It does not guarantee reconnection. It only creates conditions for reevaluation. And what happens next depends on whether that reevaluation leads to renewed interest or quiet detachment. Another key aspect is that during this stage, emotional clarity becomes more important than emotional reaction, because reacting too early can interrupt the natural process and distort the outcome, while patience allows her internal evaluation to complete without interference, and this is where many men lose effectiveness by trying to re-enter too soon, instead of allowing the reassessment process to settle fully before any action is considered. Because only after this stage is complete does the true direction of her feelings become clear. 6. Emotional closure or renewed interest signals. After reassessment, a woman typically moves into one of two emotional outcomes when you stop contacting her. Either she reaches emotional closure or she begins to show early signs of renewed interest. And both outcomes are shaped by the depth of connection and the consistency of your absence, because at this stage her mind has already processed your silence long enough to form a stable interpretation of what it means. And emotional closure happens when she accepts the absence as final or unimportant enough not to pursue further engagement, meaning she internally detaches and stops assigning emotional significance to your presence. And this is not always a dramatic decision. It is often quiet and gradual, where thoughts about you decrease and emotional reactions fade until the connection becomes irrelevant in her mental structure. Another key detail is that closure does not always come from negativity. It can come from neutrality, where she simply adjusts to life without your involvement and no longer feels the need to revisit the connection. And this is why silence can lead to complete detachment if there was not enough emotional depth before the distance began. On the other hand, renewed interest signals appear when your absence continues to create emotional contrast, where she still feels unresolved curiosity, emotional memory, or a sense of unfinished interaction, and this often shows up through indirect re-engagement attempts. Increased curiosity about your life, or subtle ways of re-establishing contact without fully committing to direct communication. Another important aspect is that renewed interest at this stage is usually more cautious than before, because she is now interacting with uncertainty, meaning she is no longer assuming your availability or emotional responsiveness, and this creates a more careful and measured approach to reconnection. Another key point is that both outcomes depend heavily on consistency of your silence, because if you break silence impulsively or respond with emotional urgency, you interrupt the natural emotional trajectory and reset the process back to earlier stages, while steady absence allows either closure or renewed interest to fully develop without distortion. Another detail is that emotional closure often feels like indifference externally, while internally it is simply resolution. And renewed interest often begins quietly before any visible action takes place, meaning both outcomes can appear subtle at first and only become clear over time, and this is why interpretation requires patience rather than immediate reaction, because the emotional direction is only fully visible once the internal processing stabilizes, and at this stage, your role is not to interfere with either outcome, but to remain consistent in your absence so that whatever is developing can do so without disruption or emotional interference from your side. 7. Final outcome. She either reaches back or fully moves on. After emotional closure or renewed interest signals, the final stage of what a woman feels when you stop contacting her is the resolution phase, where her internal process settles into one of two stable outcomes. Either she reaches back into communication or she fully moves on, and this outcome is not random. It is the result of everything that came before it, including the strength of the original connection, the emotional impact you had, and most importantly, the consistency of your absence, without interference, because by this stage, her mind has already completed its evaluation cycle, meaning she has either reestablished emotional relevance for you or allowed it to fade into the background of her life. And when she reaches back, it is usually not impulsive. It is based on accumulated curiosity, unresolved thoughts, or a reevaluation of your value in comparison to her current emotional environment. And this return often comes with caution at first, because she is now engaging with uncertainty rather than assumption, meaning she is no longer sure of your availability or emotional position. And this changes how she approaches communication, making it more measured, indirect, or careful compared to before. Another important detail is that when she fully moves on, it does not always feel dramatic from her side. It can feel like emotional quietness, where you are no longer part of her active thought process. And this is a natural result of closure being reached through acceptance rather than conflict, and this stage is important to understand because it removes illusion. It shows that silence does not guarantee reconnection. It only creates space for a decision to form, and that decision depends on emotional depth, not technique. Another key point is that many men misinterpret this stage as something they can still influence, but by the time resolution occurs, influence is already minimal because the emotional processing has already completed internally. So, any late reaction from you tends to have little effect unless there is already existing emotional momentum. Another important aspect is that regardless of which outcome happens, your stability remains the most important factor, because if she returns, your grounded state determines whether the reconnection is healthy or unstable, and if she does not return, your grounded state determines whether you remain emotionally unaffected and move forward without dependency. And this is the real purpose of silence, not to force a reaction, but to reveal emotional truth, because when you remove constant contact, what remains is what was already there beneath interaction, and that clarity is what allows you to see the situation without distortion, without chasing interpretation, and without emotional interference, making the final outcome less about control and more about understanding what was real from the beginning. At the end of everything, the real takeaway is not whether she comes back or moves on, but whether you stayed stable through the silence without collapsing into emotional reaction or chasing behavior. Because that is what actually determines your position in any situation like this, not her response, but your consistency when nothing is being given back to you in real time. And if you maintain that steadiness, you automatically avoid the cycle most men fall into, which is trying to restart connection out of anxiety instead of allowing clarity to form naturally. And once you remove that anxiety-driven behavior, your absence becomes clean, not emotional, not reactive, and not dependent on outcome, which means whatever she feels during that time is formed without interference from you. And that is where truth appears, because silence only works when it is stable, not when it is used as a tactic with hidden expectation. And if she reaches back, it will be based on her own reassessment, not pressure, and if she does not, it simply confirms that the connection had already run its course. But in both cases, you remain in control of yourself, which is the only outcome that actually matters long term. Because emotional dependence on her reaction is what creates repeated cycles, and breaking that pattern is the real shift, not influencing her feelings, but no longer being controlled by them. And that is what separates reaction from emotional stability in real life. Situations like this